8 meters down in water so dark the divers' work by touch. A hand closes around a piece of stone. It's a knife, a biface shaped by someone. It's sealed in mud that hasn't been disturbed since the day it settled. Beside it lies a mastodon tusk carved with deep parallel cuts. The lab comes back with a number 14,450 years. That's 1,500 years before the first Americans were allowed to exist. And here's the part nobody wants to talk about. This site had been saying the same thing since the 1980s. Nobody listened. The place is called Page Ladson. It sits at the bottom of the Osceola River in North Florida, about 30 miles from Tallahassee, in a sinkhole that swallowed a piece of the Ice Age and then sealed it shut. You need to understand what the divers are actually working in. This is not clear blue water with a camera crew. The Osceola is tannic, music stained the color of strong tea. And once you drop below a few meters, the light dies completely. Archaeologists go down with lights that barely help, run guidelines, and excavate by feel. They dredge sediment music through a hose. They tag finds by touch, by memory, by the shape of a thing against a glove. And the reason they keep going down there is simple. A sinkhole is a nearly perfect archive. No plow ever touched it. No burrowing animal churned it. No frost heave. No root growth. No construction crew. The water is music, low in oxygen, which means wood survives. Plant material survives. Tusks survive. Music. Sediment settles in layers and stays where it lands. Above one layer sits a younger layer. Below it sits an older one. Everything in between is trapped music in time. So when a stone tool comes out of that mud, you don't get to say it fell there. That's the whole problem in one sentence. The object was never the controversial part. Stone tools are common. Mastodon bones are common. What made this site radioactive was the mud around it, the date, music attached to it, the order, the layers, because that biface and that cut mark music tusk sat in a sealed sequence roughly 15 centuries older than the earliest Americans were music supposed to be. To see why that mattered, you have to understand the wall it hit. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology ran on one idea: music. It was called Clovis first, and it was clean, elegant, and easy to teach. In 1929, music, near Clovis, New Mexico, and later at Blackwater Draw, researchers found beautifully music, made fluted spear points lying with the bones of mammoths. Those points showed up across the continent. They dated to roughly 13,000 years ago. Music. And the story wrote itself. A single population walked out of Siberia, crossed the Bering Land Bridge, came music down through a corridor that opened between two melting ice sheets, and spread across 2 continents, music in a few centuries. Big game hunters. One wave, one route, one music, start date. And here's the thing I want to be fair about. That model was not stupid. It was built from real evidence. And for decades, it survived every test thrown at it. It made predictions. It held. But a clean story is dangerous once it becomes a career structure. Because Clovis music first didn't just describe the past, it created a rule. If your site produced a date older than Clovis, music, the burden of proof, landed on you like a building. And there were 4 words that could erase music, almost anything. Disturbed, contaminated, redeposited, geofact. The layer moved, the carbon leached. Music, the rock broke naturally. The dig was sloppy. Every one of those objections is legitimate. Every one of them is sometimes true. Music. That's exactly what made them so effective. Nobody had to hide anything. Doubt did the work. Now go back to Page Ladson, because this is where the story turns ugly. The site was not discovered in 2016. It was worked in the 1980s and the 1990s, led by researchers, including music James Dunner and the paleontologist S. David Webb. They pulled up stone tools. They pulled up that mass-tuned tusk with the long, deep parallel gouges and music hit. They ran dates. The dates came back pre-Clovis. And the field, for the most part, filed it under interesting, unproven, and moved on. Think about what that means. The evidence was already out of the ground. It was already published. It just sat there in the disputed pile for roughly 20 years because accepting it cost more than dismissing it. Then, between 2012 and 2014, a new team went back down. Jesse Halligan of Florida State and Michael Waters, music of Texas A&M with a dive crew, went into the black water, and music re-excavated the sinkhole with modern methods, modern recording, modern dating. They found a biface, music, in place inside too. Not floating in a spoil pile, not recovered from a screen, sitting in an undisturbed layer with the sediment sequence intact above and below it. Music. They ran a tight series of radiocarbon dates on plant material from the surrounding sediment. Not one date, a series. 14,550 music years, published in Science Advances in 2016. And the sting is this: music. Nothing new had to be found. The site had been telling this story for a generation. What changed was not the mud. It was the number of other places that had started saying the same thing, because Florida was not alone. Go 4,000 kilometers south to a peat bog in southern Chile called Monteverde. Tom Dilla started working there, music. In the late 1970s, on the waterlogged peat, had done something almost unheard of, music. And it preserved the soft stuff. Wood, cordage, hearths, plant remains, music, the remnants of structures, things that normally rot away within a century, sitting there after 14,000 years. And the field came for it. Not with a music conspiracy, with papers, reviews, conference sessions, and a steady, grinding insistence that something must be wrong. For nearly 2 decades, Dilla Music defended that site. The wood was natural. The dates were off. The stratigraphy was misread. Music. The artifacts weren't artifacts. He wasn't just defending a date. He was defending the idea that the map itself could be wrong. In 1997, a group of prominent skeptics, including music Vance Haynes, the geoscientist who had been Clovis First's most formidable music and most rigorous defender, traveled to Chile to see the site in person. They conceded in print. That should have been the end. It wasn't. Within a couple of years, fresh critiques were published, the arguments restarted, and the atmosphere never really cleared. Dial had been right for 20 years. He got no headline, he got exhaustion. Music. And here's the part that should have detonated the entire model and somehow didn't. Monteverde is in southern Chile. That is roughly 14,000 kilometers from the ice-free corridor. If people were living there 12,000 years ago, they didn't arrive the week music before. They had to have entered the Americas well before that. Spread across 2 continents, adapted music to deserts, mountains, rainforest, and coast. The Chilean date wasn't just a number, it was a distance problem. And distance problems are worse than dates because music can't explain them away with a contaminated sample. Now go north to Pennsylvania. Meadowcraftoft Rock Shelter is a sandstone overhang about 30 miles southwest of Pittsburgh. James Adovasio began excavating it in 1973. Music. And he did it the way you're supposed to, with obsessive recording, tight control, deep stratigraphy, layer after layer, stacked in order like pages. The deepest human occupation levels produced dates, music, pushing 16,000 years and older. The objection came fast. The site sits in coal country. Critics argue that ancient carbon, coal particulate, dissolved humates in groundwater could have leached into the samples, and music made them look older than they were. That is a real chemical concern. It deserved to be raised. But here's what happened next. Music. It got raised and raised and raised for decades, and in all that time, nobody demonstrated it. Nobody produced the contaminated carbon. Nobody showed the mechanism working at Meadowcraftoft. The objection was asserted, repeated, cited, and used, but it was never proven. The music. Meanwhile, Adovasio spent a career answering it. He became, in the eyes of much of the field, the man who couldn't take no for music and answer, a problem personality, someone who kept insisting. That's how it works. You don't need to destroy a discovery. You just need to make the person carrying it look unreasonable and then wait. And music, the objection did its job. It protected the model far longer than the data justified. Music. By now, you might be thinking, fine, a handful of weird sites. Every field has those. So let's talk about volume. In 2011, Michael Waters and colleagues published the Deborah L. Friedkin site in central Texas on Buttermilk Creek. Music. This wasn't one strange rock in one strange layer. It was thousands of stone artifacts, music flakes, blades, tools, the ordinary debris of people making things sitting in a clay layer directly beneath the Clovis material beneath it. Music, sealed under the thing that was supposed to be first. The clay was dated using optically stimulated music luminescence, which measures the last time mineral grains saw sunlight. The result, roughly 15,000 years. Music. And this is where the standard dismissal script starts to break, because the script was built for anomalies. One tool, music, one bone, one date. You can always argue that one thing slipped music through a crack. You cannot argue that an entire workshop floor slipped through a crack. One anomaly is a mistake. 15,000 artifacts is an occupation. So let's stop and be honest about what was actually happening here, because I don't want to sell you a movie villain. There was no secret committee. Nobody locked evidence in a vault. There was no memo. What there was something more ordinary and, frankly, more effective. There was peer review staffed music by people whose life's work was built on the old model. There were grant panels where a proposal to dig for pre-Clovis material was a proposal to spend somebody's money chasing a claim the field music had already rejected. There were textbooks with the corridor drawn on the map printed music and reprinted. There were museum displays cast in fiberglass with the arrows pointing the only permitted way. And there was reputational music contagion. Once a site was labeled controversial, associating with it cost you music something. Students learned that fast. Graduate advisors made sure of it. None of that requires malice. All of it requires only inertia and the very human instinct to music protect a story you spent 30 years teaching. This is not a conspiracy. It's certainty defending itself. And certainty defending itself does more damage than any conspiracy because it never has to admit it's doing anything at all. Now, come back to Florida, because Paige Ladson music had a second story in it that most people missed, that tusk. Daniel Fisher, a specialist in mastodon and mammoth remains, music examined the cut marks, deep parallel, running along the tusk. Music, in a way consistent with a person cutting through the connective tissue that holds a tusk in its socket, working it free from the skull of a dead animal. Sit with music, that image, for a second. Someone knelt in mud at the edge of a watering hole next to a dead music mastodon and cut its tusk out of its face. Probably for the ivory, probably for the material. And then they lost a knife in the mud and it stayed there for 14,500 years waiting for a diver to find it in the dark. The tool outlived the hand. The sinkhole had one more thing to say. And music, this one quietly wrecked a different textbook. Researchers analyzed Sporiella, a fungal music spore that grows in the dung of large herbivores. Its abundance in sediment tracks how many big animals were around. And at Paige Ladson, the music spores show Megapanna persisting for roughly 2,000 years after humans arrived in the region. That is a problem for the tidy overkill story where humans, music, show up and blitz the Megapanna into extinction within a few centuries. People, music, and mastodons appear to have shared that landscape for a very long time. One sinkhole, two textbook narratives under strain. And then the argument stopped being about dates and sediment, music, chemistry, and molecules, and became something a child could look at and understand. Music, New Mexico, white sands, a dried lake bed under a national park where gypsum dunes go on forever, and the wind constantly music uncovers and rearies the ground. In the old lakeshore, mud, sealed between layers of sediment, are human footprints. Not one, not a scatter. Trackways, music, hundreds of them. The prints were dated using seeds of rupia, an aquatic plant found in the layers directly above and below the tracks. The result, music published in 2021, was between roughly 23,000 and 21,000 years ago. That's not a small push. That is a wrecking ball. 23,000 years ago is deep inside the last glacial maximum. Music. The ice sheets were at their maximum extent. The corridor was closed. Under the standard model, nobody was supposed to, music, be anywhere south of the ice. Not in New Mexico, not walking around a lake. And what those tracks record is not a hunting party or music and abstraction. In one sequence, a young person, an adolescent, or a small adult, based on the prints, walks across wet mud carrying a toddler. You can see where they set the child down. The tiny prints appear. Then they're gone again, and the adult prints get deeper, picked back up, carried on. Along other parts of the flat, music, the same mud holds the tracks of mammoth and giant ground sloth. A stone tool you can argue about. You can call it a geofact. Question the layer, question the excavator. A footprint. Music is a person walking. There is no other reading. And the field's response was immediate, and I want to be clear, entirely legitimate. The critique was the hard water reservoir effect. Rupia is an aquatic plant. It takes up carbon from the water it lives in. If that water is fed by ancient groundwater carrying dissolved music-old carbon, the plant can absorb carbon that is already thousands of years old, and the radiocarbon date on the seed comes out too, music old. That is a real well-understood problem. It was the right question to ask. So they, music, went back and tested it a different way. They took radiocarbon dates on conifer pollen, terrestrial plant material, pollen from trees that took their carbon out of the air, not out of the lake. No reservoir effect possible. Same music answer. Then they used optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains in the sediment itself. An entirely independent method that has nothing to do with carbon at all. Music. It measures the last time those grains were exposed to sunlight. Same answer. 3 methods, 2 of them immune to the objection. The 2023 results held the dates. Same answer, same answer, same answer. That was the problem. And once the ceiling breaks, the room above it stops having a floor. In 2020, a team led by Cyprian Ardelian published work from Shikowit Cave, high in the Music Mountains of northern Mexico, claiming stone artifacts going back as far as 26,500 years. I want to, music, be careful here. This claim is contested, and it is not accepted by most of the field. The core criticism, music, is serious. Many researchers argue the so-called tools are geoacs, naturally fractured limestone from a music cave that produces broken rock all by itself. The debate is unresolved. The skeptics may well, music, be right, but watch what the argument reveals. Because the reflex, doubt fast, doubt hard, doubt loudest, Music is now so deeply trained into this field that it fires on everything. And it is right often enough that nobody ever examines music, the reflex itself. Which brings me to the strangest chapter in this entire story, and the one where I need you to hear the caveat as loudly as the claim. In 1992, a highway construction crew in Music, San Diego was cutting into a slope for a road expansion. A paleontological monitor spotted bone. They stopped and they excavated what turned out to be a mastodon. Music. The bones were broken. Spiral fractures, the kind you get when bone is smashed while music, it's still fresh. Around them lay heavy cobbles that looked to some eyes like music hammerstones and anvils with damage patterns and stone fragments scattered around them. They boxed it up. It went into museum storage, and there it sat for 25 years. Then in 2017, a team published the Taruti mastodon music site, Nature, dating the bone material using uranium-thorium methods to roughly 130,000 years ago, and arguing music that some hominin had smashed those bones open. Let me say this as plainly as I can. That claim is overwhelmingly music rejected. Most archaeologists do not accept it. The obvious alternative explanation is that the bones were crushed by the heavy machinery of a highway excavation. There are no stone tools at the site, no cut marks, no human remains, nothing else in the deposit that says people. The specialists who reviewed it were not being cowardly. They were being correct to push back hard. So why does it belong in this story at all? Because of where it came from. A museum drawer, a box on a shelf, a site that had been dug, bagged, cataloged, and forgotten for a quarter of a century until somebody, music, went back and looked with new methods and asked a question that had been unaskable. And because of what music, its existence, tells you about the state of the argument 20 years earlier, a claim like Taruti would have been unpublishable, laughed out of the room before it reached review. It got into Nature not because the evidence was strong, but because 13,000 years had stopped being a wall. Once the ceiling music came down, the argument no longer had an agreed-upon edge. But there's much better question sitting underneath all of this, and it's the one that actually solves the mystery. If people were in Florida at 14,500, in Chile at 14,500, music in Texas at 15,500, in Pennsylvania at 16,000, and in new music in Mexico at 23,000, then where's the trail? Where are the sites leading from Alaska down to all of them? Why is the record so thin? Here's the answer, and it's almost funny in a bleak way. They were digging in the wrong place. Look at the Channel Islands off the coast of California. Music. Human remains known as Arlington Springs mandate to roughly 13,000 music years. And here's the thing about those islands. They were never connected music to the mainland. Not at the lowest sea level, not ever. Somebody crossed open water to get there. Music. Go north to the coast of British Columbia. On Calvert Island, archaeologists excavated below a modern beach, music, and found human footprints pressed into ancient clay around 13,000 years old. Nearby, Haida Gwaii has produced early coastal sites of its own. Those weren't people who wandered down an inland corridor between two ice sheets. Those were people who lived on a coast, music, ate from a coast, and moved along a coast. That's the model researchers, music, like John Aronson, have pushed for years. A Pacific Rim coastal route, music, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. A marine ecosystem rich in fish, music, shellfish, seals, and seaweed running from Northeast Asia around the rim and down the American West Coast. No corridor required, no ice to wait for, music, just a boat, a shoreline in time. And now the killer detail. At the height of the Ice Age, sea level was roughly 120 meters. Lower than it is today. The coastline those music people walked is gone. It's underwater. It's kilometers offshore, buried under sediment on the continental shelf, drowned by the same melting ice that let the rest of us into music, the story. For 50 years, archaeologists searched the interior of North America. Music found little and treated that absence as proof the evidence isn't missing. It's submerged. And then the genetics arrived and made the whole thing messier. In Montana, at a site called Anzick, the remains of an infant were found. A Clovis-era child, roughly music, 12,700 years old, buried with red ochre and stone tools, not a specimen, a child buried by people who cared enough to cover music, them, and pigment and lay tools beside them. In 2014, the genome was sequenced, and music linked directly to the ancestry of most present-day indigenous peoples across the Americas. Then Upward Sun River in Alaska produced something else, a population geneticists, music, call the ancient Bingians, a lineage that split from the ancestors of other Native Americans, far earlier than the tidy music corridor timeline had room for. People sitting in Bingia, separated for thousands of years before anyone walked south. And then there's the signal nobody can explain. Researchers, including Pontus Skoglund, Music, and David Reich, reported a faint genetic affinity in some Amazonian populations to groups in Australasia. It's real in the data. It has never been satisfactorily music accounted for. Whatever population carried that signal into South America, we have not found their bones. Genetics, music, didn't just add a date. It added waves, plural, and at least music, one ghost. So where does that leave us? Here's what is solid. Proclovis is not a fringe position anymore. Music. It's the consensus. Monteverdi is accepted. Page Latson is accepted. Friedkin holds. Meadowcroft's music dates have never been shown to be contaminated. People were in the Americas well before music 13,000 years ago, and the coastal route is now the leading explanation. Here's what is contested. White Sands of Music has survived 3 independent dating approaches, and the case is strong, but its full implications, music, a human presence at the peak of the Ice Age, are still being fought over, and honest researchers still disagree. Here's what is not accepted. Chicky is disputed. Date of music. Karudi is rejected by nearly everyone, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The Amazonian signal, music, is unexplained, not solved, and here's what never happened. There was no reckoning. Clovis first did not collapse in public. Nobody stood up at a conference and apologized to Tom Dilla for 20 years of siege. Nobody wrote to James Adovasio, and music said we should have tested our objection instead of repeating it. No textbook printed a correction. Music. No museum label said we were wrong, and we were wrong loudly, and it cost people. The model just faded. The corridor arrow got smaller. New maps quietly. Music added a coastal line. Papers stopped mentioning the fight. Museum panels softened. Music into cautious phrasing. Recent evidence suggests the timing remains under investigation. A generation of students learned the new version and never knew there had been a war. The retreat happened in footnotes. Dill and Adovasio were music not vindicated with a headline. They were vindicated with silence. And that's the thing I can't shake. The doubt was reasonable. Every single objection was scientifically defensible. Music. That's precisely what made it so effective as a weapon. Nobody had to burn the evidence. They only had to call it contamination long enough for the people carrying it to get tired. So go back down into the oscilla. Music, back through the tannin black water, past the guideline into the sediment where the light doesn't reach. That biface is still down there in the mud in your imagination, sealed in a layer that never moved next to a tusk. Somebody cut free with their hands 14 and a half. Music 1,000 years ago on a day at a watering hole that nobody recorded, and music nobody remembers. It waited 30 years for a field that wasn't ready to hear it. Now pull back up through the river, out over the Florida coast, and keep going out past the beach, past the surf, out over the shelf where the water gets deep and music dark and stays that way. Somewhere under all of that is a shoreline, camps, hearths, middens, the actual road these people took. It took 3 decades to accept one sinkhole in Florida. How long is it going to take before anyone goes looking down there?